Hi, welcome to part 2 in our segment on other 20th century movements in art. There are quite a few. In our last segment, we started looking at Surrealism. We looked at the work of Merritt Oppenheim and her object, her fur-lined cup, and you also wrote a journal response to that. And hopefully that will kind of pave the way for us to look at artists working in more unusual materials later in the semester. We are going to continue looking at Surrealism. We're going to look at some more traditional mediums. We're looking at Frida Kahlo, who was a very well-known famous painter in Surrealism. This is known as the Two Fridas, or Las Dos Fridas, done in 1939. And this is clearly a self-portrait, and that's a theme that we see a lot of artists, especially modern and contemporary artists, start to explore. So what I want you to do is really look at the picture and start to notice some of the details and things that would sort of mark it as surreal. We're looking more at the type of surrealism, I think, that has more to do with dreams and sort of this subconscious state. Remember earlier there were different types of surrealism. And I think when you look at this, you really do see how this really clearly is probably a very accurate self-portrait of Frida Kahlo. If you really look in, you see that she does portray herself with facial hair, her eyebrows sort of coming together. So definitely it's not idealized. And these really mark a lot of the self-portraits that she did. In an era when women still wore elaborate hairstyles, hosiery, and attire, Frida Kahlo was a rebellious artist and considered kind of a loner. She often dressed in indigenous clothing related to her Mexican heritage. Moreover, she lived as an artist during a period when many middle-class women sacrificed their ambitions to live entirely in a domestic sphere, being wives and mothers. So she was sort of a pioneer in terms of scholars sort of associating her with feminist art. Frida Kahlo kind of flouted both conventions of beauty and social expectations in her self-portraits. They're very powerful and very unflinching sort of self-images that explore complex and difficult topics, including her culturally mixed heritage. She also had a medical condition with her heart, which made it very difficult for her at times. And also this sort of general idea of the repression of women that obviously was happening and still continues to happen. So it's a double self-portrait, the two Fridas. We see two seated figures holding hands and sharing a bench in front of a stormy sky. And again, these, symbolism is very important in terms of surrealism and sort of interpreting this sort of idea of dreams and the subconscious. And again, this is after Freudian and his theories were introduced into society. The Fridas are identical twins except in their attire, and so maybe think about how the attire is different, what that might signify or mean. And the attire and the clothing that she chooses to represent herself in is a very important issue in a lot of her work. This is the year that she was divorced from Diego Rivera, who is a Mexican muralist painter that we'll be looking at later. Before she married Rivera in 1929, she often wore modern European dress of the era. We see that evident in her first self-portrait. This is the one over here, in a velvet dress. And, she wears a velvet dress with gold embroidery. And it was with Diego Rivera's encouragement that Frida Kahlo really embraced her attire and started to really root herself in her Mexican customs. So when we go back and look at the clothing depicted here, it definitely is much more indigenous and more of that Mexican culture and heritage. So this is one of our first self-portraits, over here to my left, and again, she's depicted more in modern European clothing. Here we start to see where she is becoming more influenced by her Mexican heritage. She wears a necklace that is referencing her pre-Columbian roots, and also it relates to this sort of Aztec culture that we looked at when we were studying the indigenous Americas. Her earrings are done in this very sort of Spanish colonial style, and then she also is wearing more of a peasant blouse, and so we start to see a little bit of that transformation into this Mexican style of dress that she started to incorporate in her paintings. We'll look at some other self-portraits from the 1930s, and we can see how they do reflect Frida Kahlo's growing sort of obsession for indigenous attire and hairstyle. We see it evident in a portrait she did with her and Diego Rivera in 1931. And, obviously we have seen it in the two Fridas. And, she never completely abandoned dressing her subjects and herself in mainstream European dress. In this depiction, Frida Kahlo, my grandparents, my parents, the family tree portrait on the right, we see that a lot of her female relatives wear non-indigenous clothing in this particular image. Here she's wearing more of a Victorian, sort of style dress, and then the men are adorned in sort of tuxedos. But we do see some connections when we look at the two Fridas. In the sort of family tree portrait on the left, the bridal dress that Frida Kahlo's mother is wearing is reminiscent of the white stiff-collared dress that the artist wears in the two Fridas. Obviously, it's a bit more adorned and loose. And then we see this sort of grotesque view into each woman's insides. And it really has this tension of tension between the white dress. So here in the two Fridas, we see this exposure of the interior of her heart, and then here with her mother's portrait, we see this sort of inclusion of her intestines. So again, these sort of gory, insides of the human body juxtaposed against this sort of white virginal dress is very disturbing. In her brief lifetime, Frida Kahlo painted about 200 works of art, many of which are self-portraits. With the exception of a few family trees, the double portrait with Riviera and the two Fridas represent a departure in her body of work, or her oeuvre. You'll probably hear that term. It's spelled O-E-U-V-R-E, and that's basically a sort of artist's body of work. If a self-portrait, by definition, is a painting of oneself, why would Kahlo paint herself twice? So, again, these are sort of questions that you should think about asking. One way to answer this question is to examine the two Fridas as bookends to the 1931 portrait of Frida and Diego Rivera. Through this painting, though this painting was meant to celebrate the birth of their union, their tentative grasp seems to reflect Kahlo's misgivings about her husband's fidelity. So they did have a very tumultuous relationship, and I think when you zoom in this portrait with her husband, you can see, their hands are together, but not really clasped very tightly. By contrast, the double self-portrait through, that has this sort of suffering, exhibits this kind of resilience. The women, are looking at us, they're confident, their grasp seems a little bit more substantial and more unified, I think. So when some historians sort of compare these different portraits that were done in periods of her life, this portrait of her and Diego Rivera sort of reflects this uncertainty that she has about her husband and being married and his infidelity. And here we start to see her self-exploration as well as, her sort of, being a survivor. And so a bit more of a positive message. So we'll look at some details. Here in the Frida Kahlo, the two Fridas, we see a detail with a hand holding a portrait of young Diego. The bond is echoed by the vein that unites them, where one is weakened by an exposed heart. Here, we'll look back at this picture. The other is strong. So here you can sort of see where her heart's exposed, and this one's a little bit strong. The other is strong, and then where one perhaps is still sort of pining away for her lost love, and underscored by the veins feeding Riviera's miniature portrait, the other clamps down on the figurative and literal tie with her twin. And so, again, we see this sort of duality, and sort of this hesitation, her love for Diego. Obviously when you've been in a relationship with somebody, you don't completely, stop loving them. You have mixed feelings. So she's sort of, grasping to that. And then, the other Frida is, being more confident. So something you might have noticed is that her work often graphically exposes human anatomy, a topic she knew well after childhood because she had a bout of polio which deformed her right leg. She was also in a bus accident that left her disabled and unable to bear children when she was 18 years old. She would endure 32 operations as a result of this accident, so she was really in a lot of pain. And, clearly that would be very uncomfortable and very hard to deal with. So obviously this is probably reflected in her work. Frida Kahlo utilized blood as a visceral metaphor of union, as in the 1936 family portrait. Let me go back to that here, where she honors her lineage through these sort of bloody ties. She returns to this metaphor in the two Fridas, though with the added impact of two hearts, both vulnerable and laid bare to the viewer as testaments to her emotional suffering. So I wanted to show you some photographs of Frida Kahlo just to show you how accurate her self-portraits really are. To me, she really was kind of a badass woman. I mean, I love this image of her smoking a cigarette and then, wearing these beautiful indigenous, Mexican dresses and hairstyles. I mean, she really was quite exquisite, I think. So she was photographed a lot by some very famous photographers, and so these are some of the portraits. And so you do sense that she doesn't, she avoids embellishing and idealizing her features in the self-portraits, the painted self-portraits that she does. So this is the picture that you do need to know for the AP College Board. The other ones are just ones that I threw in. And one of the things I do want you to remember, too, in terms of her paintings is that, she was, beginning in her youth, she was sick quite a bit. And one of the reasons why she started painting was that she had these sort of long periods where she had to be bedridden and recover. And so she often was isolated by her health problems, which probably was a reason why she was more considered more introverted than extroverted. She had to spend a lot of time alone. And so she often reflected by painting self-portraits because she was often alone. And she was quoted as saying, I paint self-portraits because I'm so often alone, because I'm the person I know the best. And so I think that's a really good quote in terms of, understanding her self-portraits and why she did so many. The next artist that we're going to be looking at is Wilfredo Lam. This is entitled The Jungle, done in 1942. It's gouache, which is a type of sort of like watercolor, but more opaque on paper, mounted on canvas. And Wilfredo Lam remains probably one of the most renowned painters from Cuba. And his painting, The Jungle, remains his best-known work and an important painting in the history of Latin American art and the history of 20th century modernism more broadly. In the 1920s and 30s, Lam was in Madrid and Paris, but in 1941, as Europe was engulfed by war, he returned to his native country. Though he would leave Cuba again for Europe after the war, key elements within his artistic practice intersected during this period. Lam's consciousness of Cuba's socio-economic realities, his artistic formation in Europe under the influence of Surrealism, and his reacquaintance with Afro-Caribbean culture. This remarkable collision resulted in the artist's most notable work, The Jungle, which you're looking at now. So again, sometimes we don't take time to actually study these, so I do want you to take a few moments and sort of look at the image. Definitely it's very stylized and abstracted. To me, it has a lot of Cubist, I think, influence as well from Picasso. Okay. So let me show you a section of it so you can see it better. You can get a better sense. The Jungle, currently on display at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, has an undeniable presence within the gallery. The cluster of these sort of mysterious faces, limbs, and sugar cane, and I know it's probably hard to see, but that's what the subject is, these sort of images of the sugar cane plant, crowd a canvas that is nearly 8 feet square. So again, it's unfortunate that we can't get a sense of the scale, but this is a very large scale painting. Lam's bold painting is a game of perception. The artist haphazardly constructs the figures from a collection of distinct forms. He uses crescent-shaped faces, prominent rounded backsides, willio or lanky arms and legs, flat, sort of cloddish, blocky hands and feet, as you can see here. So again, very, very abstracted, very somewhat geometric. The disproportion among the shapes generates sort of an uneasy balance between the composition's denser top and more open bottom. So you can kind of see here at the top where it becomes a little bit more suffocating, and then it gets a little bit more heavier and a little bit more, there's a little bit more space towards the bottom. So there are not enough feet and legs to support the upper half of the painting, is sort of the perception that you get, which seems on the verge of toppling over. So these sort of heavier, sort of blockish feet and hands really can't support the weight of all this stuff happening at the top of the composition. Another significant element with Lam's game of perception is how he plays the figures within an unorthodox landscape. Lam's panorama excludes the typical elements of a horizon line, sky, or wide view, because again, this is supposed to be, it's called the jungle. So we think of landscape, and we all, so those are traditional features that we associate with a landscape composition. Instead, there is a tight, directionless snapshot with only the faintest sense of ground. So it's very compressed, very claustrophobic. And again, this is related to this idea of hors vacui. This was a term that we learned about first with Greek vase painting, where artists would sort of paint in and not leave very much negative space for fear that spirits would come through. And so he definitely is using or utilizing that concept as well in the painting, hors vacui. So in addition to figures and the sugar cane, there's some images of flora and plants that are indigenous to the jungle. But one part of the flora in the scene is the sugarcane, which is not, would not have been located in a jungle setting, suggested by the painting's title. Sugarcane does not grow in jungles, but rather is cultivated in fields. So here, what do you think Lam is trying to say with this title, and this sort of information that we know about sugarcane and how it's harvested? So, in 1940s, in Cuba, sugarcane was very big business, requiring thousands of laborers, similar to the cotton industry in America's South before the Civil War. The reality of laboring Cubans was in sharp contrast to how foreigners perceived the island nation. So you had these sort of Europeans coming in to Cuba and sort of treating it as like a pleasure sort of playground, a resort area. But in the reality was that the people who actually lived in Cuba really had to toil and work very hard to harvest this sugar cane. Lam's painting remains an unusual Cuban landscape compared to the tourist posters that depicted the country as a destination for Americans seeking beachside resorts. So here's an example. This is a postcard that is more indicative of what people thought Cuba was like. You know, visit Cuba and you have this Cuban dancer, and it looks like it's fun, and you're going to go to the beach and sit in the sun. But when we look at Lam's depiction of the jungle, it definitely it's not a positive painting. It definitely isn't about pleasure and, enjoying oneself in leisure. It's the opposite. So while you have Americans and Europeans visiting Cuba and sort of staying in these resorts and having these sort of pleasure vacation experiences, U.S. corporations ran their businesses, including sugarcane production. Though Cuba gained independence from Spain at the end of the 19th century, the United States maintained the right to intervene in Cuba's affairs, which destabilized politics on the land, on the island for decades. European modernism and Santeria. This is a theme we're going to look at as well. During the interwar period in Paris, Lam befriended the Surrealist who did influence his work, and we do see that influence in The Jungle along with some other ones. Surrealists aimed to release the unconscious mind, suppressed, they believe, by the rationale in order to achieve another reality. In art, the juxtaposition of irrational images reveal a super reality or a surreality. So that's where you get the word realism. In Lam's work, an otherworldly atmosphere emerges from the constant shifting taking place among the figures that are at once human, animal, organic, and mystical. So they kind of morph into those categories. This metamorphosis is among the figures is related to Lam's interest in Afro-Caribbean culture. When the artist resettled in Cuba in 1941, he began to integrate symbols from Santeria, an Afro-Cuban religion that mixes African beliefs and customs with Catholicism, into his art. During Santeria ceremonies, the supernatural merges with the natural world, making masks, animals, or humans who become possessed by a god. These ceremonies are moments of metamorphosis, where a being is at once itself and otherworldly. So, again, this is, Santeria kind of, it reminds me of the transformation masks that we looked at with the North Native American indigenous culture that we studied in our last unit. So with his art, Lam created a new narrative within the Cuban imagination rooted in the island's complex history. His work was opposite to the picturesque frivolity that mired in sort of the nation's stereotype as sort of a resort vacation spot. He was quoted as saying, "I refused to paint cha-cha-cha. I wanted with all my heart to paint the drama of my country, but by thoroughly expressing the Negro spirit in this way. I could act as a Trojan horse that would spew forth hallucinating figures with the power to surprise, to disturb the dreams of the exploiters. I knew I was running the risk of not being understood either by the man in the street or by the others, but a true picture has the power to set the imagination to work, even if it takes time. And so the jungle is both enigmatic and enchanting and has inspired generations of viewers to liberate their imaginations. All right, I'm going to stop here. There will be a part 3. In that segment, we're going to be looking at the movement of constructivism, which flourished in Russia in the 20th century. So stay tuned.